Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the Miller Center. Hopefully you've had a somewhat relaxing summer, but if you didn't, it's understandable. The tumult in our country and around the world that we've all gone through in the last several months, often watching at home, has certainly been disquieting. And now we're turning the corner. And as it's 2 months exactly away from the presidential election, bracing ourselves for even more ups and downs. It is September 3rd and the election's on November 3rd. So for the next 2 months, we'll be watching carefully all things political and presidential. And today we've got a two-panel discussion that will explore the ins and outs of this, with both the Democratic and the Republican conventions now in our rear view mirror. We saw it all on display in the last few weeks. The continuing controversies around how we as a country and how the world have addressed the coronavirus epidemic, and then the ongoing racial justice reckoning in the United States, particularly around police reform and beyond. And now on top of that, we have the logistics and the legitimacy of voting, whether in person, in advance, absentee, or through mail-in ballots. It all seems so new and disorienting, and yet we've probably been there before in one way or another on so many of these issues. Crisis and disarray have impacted past elections. So we have an all-star lineup to look at today and yesterday and how it all affects tomorrow and the next 2 months. Our all-star lineup will be done in two panels of three. The first panel will run from now until about 11 o'clock and will provide a state of the 2020 election contest. And then we'll look back at previous elections in crisis. So for the first half of today's session, we welcome Yamiche Alcindor and UVA's own Larry Sabato for a conversation moderated by UVA and the Miller Center's Jen Lawless. Yamiche Alcindor is PBS NewsHour's White House correspondent, as well as a contributing reporter for NBC News and MSNBC. Prior to her current post at PBS, she covered President Trump and Bernie Sanders' 2016 presidential campaigns for the New York Times and various racially charged shootings in Ferguson, Baltimore, and Sanford following the death of Trayvon Martin. She brings depth of experience reporting on so many different issues being wrought across the country at this moment, and we're lucky to have her with us and her insight. And it's always my highest honor to introduce my first American politics professor, my first mentor, my undergraduate advisor, and now my colleague here at UVA, Larry Sabato. He's a living legend here at UVA and is a nationally known figure, renowned for his political analysis and contributions to not just political science, but to various news outlets across the country. Here at UVA, Larry founded the Center for Politics and has authored dozens of books on American politics, making him a New York Times best-selling author. He's also the editor-in-chief and creator of Larry Sabato's Crystal Ball, a comprehensive nonpartisan political analysis and handicapping newsletter founded in 2002. Larry and the Center have also produced award-winning documentaries, including a new one, Dismantling Democracy, which is just premiering this week in production with our friends, co-production with our friends in Richmond at VPM, Virginia's Home for Public Media. Professor Sabato has taught some 20,000 students over the course of 40 years here at UVA and has been the much deserving recipient of UVA's highest honor, the Thomas Jefferson Award. So thank you so much, Larry, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Finally, our moderator is one of the Miller Center's own, Jennifer Lawless, who is the Commonwealth Professor in Politics and the chair of the Department of Politics at UVA. She's also the Democracy Initiative's Faculty Advisory Council Director and was the academic co-director of the Democracy Initiative for her first year at UVA. So as soon as Jen arrived at UVA, we started piling on the responsibilities, and it's been a real pleasure to work with her. She's the co-author of co-author of six terrific books, which focus on American politics, the role of women in politics, media, elections, and campaigns. And she's currently teaching a class on the 2020 election, and many of her students are tuning in today. Having seen the syllabus and the various guest speakers, she and Mary Kate Carey, her co-teacher, also a Miller Center Senior Fellow, have lined up. It's great to know that the tradition of top-notch political science research and teaching continues here at our beloved university. So there's nobody better to lead our show today and to kick things off than Jen Lawless. Jen, thank you so much, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. And before we begin and I start asking my questions, I want to encourage everybody who's watching to use the Q&A function at the bottom of their screen to type in questions. I'm not going to ask a bunch of questions and hold all of yours till the end. I'll weave back and forth toward the audience. So as soon as you have a thought, please type it in. So first, Larry and Yamiche, thank you for joining us today. And let me just begin with a question that is probably not what people are expecting. We talk so much about how this election cycle is different, how we don't really know what we should anticipate. I want to ask you both, when you compare 2020 to previous cycles, what's the same? What are some of the fundamentals that, regardless of who's running, regardless of this political environment, we know we can bank on because this is how elections work? Larry, do you want to start?
Sure. What's the same? Donald J. Trump. What's the difference? He's the incumbent now. He was the challenger running against a candidate that apparently tens of millions of people regarded as very controversial, Hillary Clinton. Not that Joe Biden doesn't have controversies, but this is a compliment, believe it or not. He's kind of bland. A lot of people think we need more bland. We need more banana after the last 4 years. And Democrats ended up nominating him despite not being overly excited by him, which again may have been a very mature judgment on their part. Look, normally we say elections are determined by the state of the economy and by war and peace issues and by scandal. I think we can cut scandal out after the last decade or so. I'm not sure scandal has much impact on anything anymore. But in terms of the economy, we're going to have to rewrite the textbooks, Jen, including you've got another edition of all those books coming, because the economy, while still fundamental and very important, is not as central as it normally would be because of the pandemic. Who the heck ever had a pandemic in their model? No one I know of, because it didn't work in 1918 and 1919. We didn't have a presidential election then. So anyway, I don't want to take up too much time. I'll just throw that out there to start things off and turn it over to you and Yamiche.
Yamiche, when you're thinking about covering presidential elections and politics in general, what do you think has remained pretty much the same over the course of the last 4 years? And what do you think is the biggest change?
I think the thing that's probably remained the same is that presidential elections and politics in general are about personality and about feeling connected to someone. So I think before even President Trump, we go back to McCain versus President Obama. What you saw was two men who were really trying to convince America that they were the person who had the best vision for the future of America, that they were the man who had the policies, but really the heart and the mind to lead the country. I think if you then go to 2016, you see Hillary Clinton running against the idea of President Trump, saying that he's someone who would be an abomination to the country, that he's not a reflection of our ideals. And now Joe Biden is running a sort of similar campaign in that he is saying that that President Trump is a sort of existential crisis, an existential threat to American democracy, to the future of America, to the institutions of America, to the very democracy. And you see in President Trump, him making the same argument, saying this is the most important election in our history. And he's saying on his end that Joe Biden is a Trojan horse of socialism, that he's someone who presents a threat to American democracy. So I think what you see is still this idea of the person next to me, or the opponent rather, that they are a danger to society. I think back in 2012, 2008, you didn't see two people who were, I think, saying that that person was dangerous in the same way. You now have in Joe Biden and in President Trump, two men who are saying, not only do I not agree with this person politically and my policies are better, but what you see are two people who are saying that person is dangerous. That person cannot be trusted with the democracy.
And to just follow up on that, and this is also a question that just came in from the audience, How has that change affected political reporting and how you can think about covering the White House and covering the elections?
I think it gets back to talking to people, and especially Americans, about what they see as life or death in their own minds. I think back to 2008, when we were thinking through who we were going to choose between McCain and President Obama, and a lot of people saw the economy as a life or death issue, that they were not going to be able to survive America if they didn't have somebody in a party that they felt like could lead them through that. And they wanted someone who made them feel hopeful because things felt so hopeless then. So fast forward, I'm really interested in the way that Americans are reacting first to the pandemic. The president has obviously said a lot of things that are misleading about the pandemic, but he's also trying to cast the pandemic as something that's in the rearview mirror of America, that America will get through this, that the economy will come roaring back. And Joe Biden is someone who's been saying the president has not kept people safe and that he's not focused enough on the thousands of Americans who have died from this virus. So when I'm out reporting, I'm talking to people about how much they feel like the virus is a threat to their existence and a threat to their future and a threat to the things and the hopes and the dreams that they have, or how much do they find it a threat that racism and the way that America is structured, how much that is a threat to their everyday lives. So there are a lot of African Americans who see us as living in a dual pandemic, the pandemic of racism and the pandemic of the coronavirus. And there are a lot of people who don't see things that way, who see the pandemic as the top issue and who see race and social justice as something that could be a secondary thought. And as a result, they're really rattled by the idea that American cities are seeing pockets of violence, even though the vast majority of protests have been peaceful. They're focused on that. And if that person is someone who sees protesters as a threat to their existence, and they're worried that their neighborhood is going to be overrun by people who are calling for racial justice, they're usually a Trump supporter. So I think it's really interesting to look at how the president is able to pivot, especially in what I think is a critical inflection point right now. We're seeing polling that's showing that people's support for the Black Lives Matter movement is going down as the protests continue. There are Black Lives Matter activists who say that is a result of what the president's been doing, which has really been demonizing protesters. But that's also a result of what the natural life of any social justice movement is, which is that in the 1960s, if you polled people after Selma, after we saw John Lewis get beat in front of the nation, most Americans were not in favor of him marching across that bridge. Most Americans were not in favor of the 1960s Civil Rights Act. And as a result, there's a lot of people in this country who are saying we can't only focus on the public opinion of Americans, because Americans back in the day, back in history, they were not in favor of basic human rights for African Americans when in a time where now we look back and romanticize all of the things that happened.
So building on that, Larry, there are obviously 435 House races up for grabs. There are almost 3 dozen Senate seats. How are these dynamics, both the pandemic and racial justice, trickling down into congressional elections? And what should news consumers be looking for there when they think about what to expect in November?
Jen, two words tell you almost everything that we need to know. Believe it or not, it's not the pandemic or racial injustice or the economy. It's partisanship and polarization. Sometimes we cover issues or we have forums like this and we pretend that there are tens of millions of people undecided out there who are weighing all these issues seriously. No, they're interpreting the issues through their partisan prism. Everybody has one, or almost everybody has one. There are so few hardcore independents. And over the past 20 years, but especially in the last 10 or so, we have intensified the partisanship aspect of it, which has polarized us because the parties are much further apart, especially on social issues, but also on other dimensions than they've been in past eras. I'll often joke that R and D are the 2 most important letters in the English language because they explain so much. We'll have some ticket splitters. I think we'll be shocked at how few there are. Most Republicans are going to cast a straight ticket vote from the White House to the courthouse. Most Democrats are going to cast a straight ticket vote from the White House to the courthouse. And so while you will have a few cases of a president of one party carrying a state and a Senate candidate or gubernatorial candidate of the other party carrying the state, mostly as in 2016, where every Senate seat lined up perfectly with the presidential vote. You're going to have single ticket, single party, single ticket voting. You can argue about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. That's a separate discussion. And there's an aspect of this I'd like to stress because it's getting way too much attention, which is the defections. And this year, I don't know of many, really any prominent Democrats who've defected to Trump. There may be one or two here or there at the state level or local level, but national figures, not so much. There are a lot of senior Republicans. In fact, just this morning, Governor Rick Snyder, two-term Republican governor from Michigan, defected to Biden. And there have been a long list from the Bush administration and from the Romney campaign and the McCain campaign. And we need to and Hillary Clinton got 90% of the Democratic vote and Donald Trump got 90% of the Republican vote. What's changed as far as we can see now, trying to project to November 3rd? Joe Biden is getting 93 to 95% of the Democratic vote. Donald Trump is getting 93 to 95% of the Republican vote. So we've intensified the polarization and the partisanship, and it actually explains the vast majority of what we're seeing. And we're not interpreting it through that partisan prism, and we probably should.
That's music to my ears. That's one of the basic arguments in most of what I've written. In fact, an upside to polarization that people don't often think about is that it's rendered the sex of the candidate almost moot. So people cast a ballot based on the D or the R in front of your name, not the presence or absence of a Y chromosome in your DNA. And
exactly.
Actually helped candidates who might otherwise seem like they are at a disadvantage. We've been getting a bunch of questions. I want to pivot now to the role of the debates. We're coming off of the conventions where the polling suggests that we're pretty much where we started before the conventions. A few more people have decided how they're going to vote, but in terms of the margin and the breakdown, life doesn't look that much different. What should we expect in terms of the debates? Yamiche, do you want to give us a shot? Is it going to matter? Are the debates going to matter? Are there certain questions that could really encourage people to turn out to vote or keep them home? Are there liabilities that the candidates should try to avoid? When you're thinking about the debates, what do you think matters most to you?
I think Larry said it pretty smartly, which is that most Americans are focused on the D or the R next to the person's name. I think polling shows I've talked to some experts that say that there maybe is 3 to 5% of Americans who are undecided. So maybe there's a sliver of the population that is going to make a decision based on these debates. But I think that the vast majority of people have in some ways made up their minds. I think what we're going to see is fireworks. Two men are really fighting not just for the presidency, but for their legacies, for what they think is the future of the country. So we're going to see, I think, some really heated exchanges. I think I'm really interested to see how Senator Harris and Vice President Pence, how their debate goes, because they are two people who also are really interesting in the way that they communicate. Thinking of Senator Harris as really communicates like a prosecutor and is very logical and is in some ways someone who does go for the hearts and minds, but is someone who can really, I think, break down an argument and ask tough questions. When you think about Mike Pence, he's someone who has really been very good at being steely, at defending the Trump presidency with full-throated defenses, while also appealing to evangelicals, white evangelicals in particular. So I think it's going to be really interesting, but I'm not sure how much the debates are going to matter in terms of how Americans make their decisions. I think if there are breakout moments, they're going to be interesting and they're going to be news moments, but I'm not quite sure how much it's going to matter in terms of the actual results of the election. I also think that when it comes to things that the candidates are going to be wanting to focus on, both candidates are going to be wanting to talk about race and social justice and this idea of what their view of how these protests have gone on. Both candidates are going to condemn violence. I think the president is likely going to be talking and giving some information, frankly, about the coronavirus, because it is a place where we see, at least based on polling, that people really are questioning his response to the coronavirus. And he struggled, of course, in that response. So we've seen Republicans and White House officials talk about the coronavirus as if it's behind us, as if it's in our rear view mirror. Well, we know, of course, that that's simply not true, that the death rate in the United States is per capita is among the worst, if not the worst, when you look at modernized, industrialized countries. We're second only to India, last time I checked, in terms of the number of cases that we're seeing per day, which is about 42,000 per day on average in the last week and a half. So I think the president, you didn't hear those kinds of numbers at the Republican National Convention. And I think Joe Biden will likely be wanting to quote whatever the newest numbers are to President Trump and putting it to him that way.
Larry, what do you think about when you think about the potential of the debates to be relevant or affect change or give the candidates an opportunity to motivate their own bases?
Yamiche cited something very important. 3 to 5% are quote undecided, and actually half of them won't vote because they're conflicted, and the other half, at least most of them, have some reasonable leaning, even if it's slight, to one party or the other. And again, as you know well, Jim, the research has shown that the leaners vote with the parties as much, sometimes more, than those who openly declare affiliation to a party. So that tells you the answer right there. The debates are great entertainment. Hey, we don't have much live football this year, do we? And people can't go to watch the games. Well, they're going to tune in to the debates for the game, and they're going to tune in to cheer for their team. They're going to cheer for their side. And they're all going to get talking points. They're all going to have their views reinforced because they're inclined to believe whatever their candidate says, and they'll cite it. Boy, he really gave a great answer there. He showed that, fill in the blank. And so I'm glad we have them. I think it increases public knowledge about politics. But, I can only think of 2 debates where the debates might have determined the election. I'm talking at the presidential level. Of course, the first ones we all know about. And Kennedy, I don't think would have won without particularly the first debate or the debates generally. And of course, Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford with that, supposed goof by Gerald Ford about, freeing Poland. We don't want to get into that, but that's it. You go through the other presidential and vice presidential debates, and there's some great lines, things that everybody remembers. I knew John Kennedy. John Kennedy was a friend of mine, and Senator Quayle, John Kennedy. We remember it, and who won? The Bush-Quayle ticket. So I don't think it makes that much difference, but we all watch to find the moment that will be remembered by history, even if it doesn't matter.
We are getting a lot of questions about polls and whether we should be worried about silent Trump voters who are unwilling to tell pollsters that they're willing to cast a ballot or plan to cast a ballot for Donald Trump. Kellyanne Conway just this morning, I believe, mentioned that she thinks that that's the way that they're going to win the election and the polling is wrong. I always tell my students, I tell everybody that I talk to that the national polls did a pretty good job in 2016. The major problem is that we have an electoral college, so it's the state polls that matter. What's your advice to people that are sort of watching the polls this election cycle? Where should they look? What should they be skeptical about? Do you think that we're going to see a repeat of 2016 where the national polls get it right, but low sample sizes and crummy polls at the state level sort of mess up the potential outcome in terms of what people are expecting? Larry, do you want to?
Sure. Basically, the national polls, I think, will be right again, the polling average, not individual polls. Some of them are way out there because you have outliers. Statistically, you have outliers. And you never know which one is the outlier. That's why you do the polling average. And polling averages aren't perfect, but they do wash out a lot of the error. So I think the national polls will come reasonably close to whatever the breakdown is. What fooled a lot of us in 2016 was that even the reliable polls, ones that had proven themselves year after year after year, were wrong in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and other states. Michigan didn't have enough polling to be able to tell, but that's where we were surprised. And so I think the lesson most of us took away from that is absolutely look at them, learn from them. Look at the breakdowns for various demographics. It teaches you things, but they're not gospel. They were not handed to Moses on the Mount. And having said that, look, there's been research about the hidden Trump vote, and generally it concludes that there wasn't much of a hidden Trump vote. But of course, I wonder whether it was hidden from the researchers too. Very unscientific way, I add a point or two to Trump's total. Maybe it's enthusiasm, maybe it's a hidden vote, maybe it's a combination. I'll add a point or two. And then for the Electoral College, absolutely, I'll add a couple of points. Hillary Clinton proved that you can carry the popular vote by 2.1% and still lose the Electoral College decisively. Maybe I should be adding 3 points or 4 points, but I'm going to stick to 2 plus 1 or 2 for the hidden Trump vote. So when you look at the polls, maybe to make Kellyanne happy, I've known Kellyanne for years, I don't want her to be unhappy. Go ahead and add a couple of points in for both, for the hidden vote and for the Electoral College. How's that for the scientific method, Jen? Are you impressed?
Very systematic, very systematic.
Yeah, there you go.
Yamiche, are there things that you hear, whether it be at White House briefings or from voters or on the campaign trail in general, as much as we have a campaign trail this cycle, that suggest there are dynamics that the polls just aren't really picking up? Not necessarily silent Trump voters, but just a sense that something isn't being captured by what we're seeing in these polls?
I'm not sure. I mean, I haven't been on the campaign trail, so I've not been traveling like I usually would. I haven't been talking to voters. I've been talking to voters on Skype, which is much different. So I haven't really been out there to say whether or not there's something in the air that isn't being captured. I remember in 2016, I did a story about Trump voters and Trump supporters who had voted for Obama. This was before the election. And I remember thinking it was going to take me a while to do that story. And I literally could have did that story in one day. And it was striking to me how many people were at Trump rallies and said, yeah, I voted for Obama and I'm voting for Trump now, because they were the change voters. They were the kind of, this one voter put it this way, and I think it's probably encapsulates something that stuck with me. He said, I'm a hot hand voter. He says, whoever has a hot hand, whoever feels like they're the person who's most energetic, who feels like they're the person who just feels like the person who was most interesting, that's who I vote for. So I don't know if there's a hot hand in this election in the same way. I think the one thing that probably is weighing on people's is their how they feel America is fair to them, and whether or not they feel like they're getting their fair shot and being treated fairly. I think that there's this underlying feeling among Democrats, and especially among African Americans, that the country's just not functioning for them in the right way, and that the country and that the police and the schools and the healthcare system, they just aren't functioning in the way that they are supposed to function for African Americans. And I think for a lot of Trump supporters, I also think that they feel like people who talk about the flaws in America, that they are somehow, there's a victim ideology is the way that they put it, and that they feel like they're not congratulating America and celebrating America in the right way. I don't know how that's going to be reflected in the polls, but I think that that's probably the biggest thing that I sense among voters and among just in the atmosphere is, how do you think about America? Is it wrong to talk about the fact that America stole the land from Native Americans and enslaved African Americans for hundreds of years? Is that too uncomfortable? Or should we just focus on the promise of America and talk about the idea that we at some point will be able to be a better country?
So you raise an interesting point, because it's possible, we've seen, I think this cycle for sure, people to look at the country and look at the same facts, look at the same circumstances, and through a polarized lens, arrive at completely different conclusions. And in some ways, that's the best case scenario, because I said that they're relying on the same facts. But we've been getting a lot of questions coming in about false information, fake news that's actually incorrect or untrue, versus fake news where politicians are just saying that something is fake because they don't want to deal with it. How should we be thinking about and navigating the onslaught of information when basically both parties say what they want voters to hear, and one side seems to be willing to continue to push information that is repeatedly discredited? So are the two sides playing on an equal playing field? Is it level? I mean, Yamiche, this is a question first. I'll go to you. I mean, when you're sitting in the White House briefing room and listening to information that you know is not true, what do you do? And what's the responsibility of the media more broadly?
I mean, I think that we've seen reporters fact check the president. I've obviously checked the president while asking a question to him. I think that's the responsibility of reporters. I think it's also the responsibility of voters to figure out what information is true is, what information isn't. I think obviously reporters are presenting information, but I think honestly people need to be educating themselves as well to understand what's going on in this country. And I think that we saw a lot of that, especially after the George Floyd killing, where we saw a lot of people reaching out and trying to really understand, what does discrimination look like? What is systemic racism when we talk about it so much? We use these words, institutional racism. What does that look like? I had a lot of friends reach out to me to say, well, what should I be doing to really understand this? And it's reading books and it's understanding. I think that there are times where we put the onus on the candidates and the media, and as if we also don't have a personal responsibility to understand what's going on in our own country. And then in terms of a level play, I think what's really interesting in this age of Joe Biden versus Donald Trump is that President Trump is dealing with a party who has stuck with him through all sorts of scandal and who sticks with him when he doesn't tell the truth, when he outright lies. The Republicans really fall in line. Joe Biden is dealing with a party that has really high standards for their person. And by high standards, I mean, not just that they're better, that he's a better candidate. That's not what I intend to suggest. What I mean is that he is someone, if he says something wrong, Nancy Pelosi would call him out. If he says something that is untrue, his voters will say, well, that's not true and we don't like that. He will have to apologize. If he says things like, if you're not black, you're not black if you vote for Donald Trump. He had to come out and apologize immediately for that, right? If he says Donald Trump never called out white supremacists, reporters like me will say, well, that's not true. Here's the time where the president called out white supremacy, but there are people who think that he has enacted and used rhetoric that is in favor of white supremacy overall. So I think that he is being held to a more harsher standard by his voters than, and he's being asked to call out to condemn violence over and over again, even though they're the people who are committing that violence. We don't know if they're Democrats. We don't know if they're Black Lives Matter protesters. We don't know who the people are at times that are burning down these buildings, but they get the label of Black Lives Matter protesters. So he's having to contend with that issue too, in a way that the president isn't having to do. And especially when you think of, I'll say really quickly, the Kyle Rittenhouse shooting, where the president defended the 17-year-old who shot people, killed 2 people, and Republicans are in lockstep right behind him. I'm not sure if we see a protester who's a supporter of Joe Biden shoot 2 people and Joe Biden come out and defend that person. I don't know if Nancy Pelosi and Democrats coalesce around Joe Biden to say, yes, on our side, we should also be shooting people. I don't know if that's going to be true. I don't think it's going to be true.
Yeah, Larry, how do you think about the role of facts, and then also the willingness to disregard facts that's not equitably distributed across the ideological spectrum?
Well, we live in the post-factual era. I'm sorry to say that. And I think most academics recoil from that because we depend on facts and provable facts and replicated facts. But they don't matter as much as they once did because of the internet, social media, and it's difficult to confirm many of the things you see. I'll give you good news and bad news. Let's balance that, okay? The good news is that because of what happened in 2016, more and more people and institutions, news and otherwise, are aware of how the system can be manipulated to push it and the voters toward lies, not just misrepresentations, outright lies from domestic actors and foreign actors. The news we got late last night and this morning from Facebook is encouraging if they do what they say they're going to do, which is in the critical final week. I think it should be more than a week because of people's early voting due to the pandemic and other things. But at least for a week, they're going to purge somehow, the misrepresentations, the phony stuff, the advertisements that stoke racial fears. That's why I said if they can actually do this. It's going to take an army of people to uncover a lot of this. I know they use various formulas, but they're going to miss some. But they say they're going to get it all. And according to Zuckerberg, and he ought to be held to account, He says they're going to continue it after the election, because after the election, in all likelihood, there will be a lot of close races. Maybe the presidential in some states, certainly some Senate races and House races, and there will be people trying to maneuver the system into declaring victory for a candidate. And once that happens, it's really difficult to get people to backtrack. People accept that, and then you have to prove that what they know is wrong. So the good news is that people are aware and they're trying to do something about it. I'm withholding judgment as to how successful they're going to be. But here's the bad news, and it's eternal. 6% of Americans really believe that we did not land on the moon, that this was all done in the desert, and some say Arizona, others say Nevada. There are 330 million Americans. Do the math. That's millions and millions of Americans. Just for the record, I've talked to Buzz Aldrin. They really did land on the moon. Either that or he's the most convincing liar on earth. But if 6% of Americans can believe that, then imagine, given what people don't know about politics, millions will believe about any subject, especially if it comes from the candidate they're inclined to support and vote for. Just yesterday, and I'll conclude with this, just yesterday, I'm sometimes my jaw's on the floor, even now after all the statements Donald Trump has made. Yesterday, he essentially encouraged his supporters to commit voter fraud. The guy who's claimed ever since 2016 that the whole system is corrupted because of voter fraud. He really won the popular vote in 2016. No, he didn't. And he's projecting fraud before anybody votes, really, in this election. But he encouraged them to vote by mail and then go to the polls and see if they can vote again, just to see whether the system works. Yeah, they'll see whether the system works or not, the criminal justice system. That's what they're going to see, whether it works or not, if they actually follow through. But that's where we are. And Yamiche has to put up with this day after day after day in person. And I salute her for it, but it's tough to do. It's tough to do, and it's getting worse, not better. And we better find ways to back up. So let's hope Facebook succeeds.
You know, when we think about Election Day and the week or month following the election, there are an array of issues that have little to do with the kinds of questions we're talking about now, which is about the role of COVID or the role of the economy or anything else, right? The first thing is it possible for all of these absentee ballots and mail-in votes to be counted in a way that where we know the results within a couple of days? Some states have laws on the books that don't even allow them to begin opening those ballots until Election Day. And then beyond that, during this time of uncertainty, what are the options and what is the president going to do? Rick Santorum, who actually won the Iowa caucuses in 2012, says that it doesn't matter if you win if nobody knows. No one realizes that he knows because that he won, because that result was called 3 weeks later. And so what should we be looking for in those days and in those potential weeks following, assuming that we have a close election? I mean, if it's a blowout and it comes down to a series of states where, regardless of the margin in those states, the outcome isn't in question, that's a different story. But if this is a contested election, what do you think we should expect from both sides, from both campaigns? Yamiche, what are you hearing in terms of both the Biden and the Trump campaigns on this front?
I mean, I don't really like to engage in this that much because I feel like it's speculating. So I don't know I don't know what we can expect if there's, I don't know what we can expect if there's not a clear result of the election. I think President Trump has been saying that he thinks that the only way he can lose is if the election is rigged. And Joe Biden, of course, is saying, we need to follow the ideals and make sure that everyone gets their vote counted. President Trump, of course, yesterday made those controversial comments about his supporters voting. And then today, literally just a few minutes ago, and I'm not sure if you can see me looking down at my phone constantly, but it's like this thing that I do because you cover President Trump, but you're always waiting for something to happen. And literally he just tweeted about the fact that, well, what I really mean is that people should vote by mail, and then go to the precincts and go and make sure that your vote is counted. So that's him really trying to already clean up the vote, the comments that he made, literally live as we're sitting here. So I think that I think to speculate on what the president's going to do, we know that he's going to take to Twitter. We know he's going to be angry if he loses, or he's going to be angry if the election results are not clear, because he's going to say this is part of the rigged election that he's been telling people about for months. But there's been a lot of speculation of like, what if he doesn't leave office, and what if he loses and then he doesn't? To me as a reporter, I just there's so much to cover. I can't engage in kind of the hypothetical thinking, because there's so much to deal with in front of me, including the fact that the president is literally this morning trying to say, wait, I didn't mean voter fraud per se. What I meant was double and actually go in person, mail in your vote because you want to be safe, but still go to that same precinct to look at it in the middle of a pandemic. So who knows what that's really going to look like.
Right, and go to that precinct when, by the way, there are thousands of people who are trying to cast votes, and those poll workers might be a little bit busy otherwise. Larry, what are your thoughts about sort of the doomsday scenarios that a lot of people are putting forward regarding the health of a democracy?
Well, Yamiche won't speculate because of her field. She's right not to speculate. Speculation is my bread and butter, so of course I'm going to speculate. Look, if you mentioned a doomsday scenario, and a lot of them are being talked about. And there's one good piece of news there. All of them can't happen, but one might. We don't know which one. And that goes all the way to January 20th, and whether if Trump loses, he will actually yield the White House. A Republican operative at the beginning of the Republican convention, and I've known him for years, and we talk openly, and I would never identify him. But he said to me something very interesting. He says, never forget, possession's 9/10 of the law. So who possesses the White House? Well, we saw what happened when President Trump gave his speech. It's clear he thinks that he possesses it. It's not an American voter possession. It's his possession. I don't want to get into that because we'll deal with that when we have to deal with it. And one hopes we won't have to deal with it because Trump either won't try something or Trump will win. Although even if he wins, you can be sure, as he did in 2016, he's going to say it was a fraudulent election. He's the first person in the history of humankind to call an election he won fraudulent, which is what he did in 2016. You can't make this stuff up. Nobody would believe it. So here's what I want us to do. And this is important, Jen, I think for academics, and Yamiche would certainly agree it's important for the news media. We need to prepare the public early and over again, not just one package on one night on PBS NewsHour, repeatedly on all channels. We have to prepare people for the fact that the election day vote, which will be counted for the most part on election day and night, is going to be disproportionately Republican for obvious reasons. It probably would have been anyway, but given what President Trump has said about mail-in ballots and absentees to a certain degree, a lot of Democrats are going to be voting absentee and a lot of Republicans are not. So the vote that takes longer to count is going to be much more Democratic, or at least more Democratic in most states. So we can't let any candidate declare victory before we have good samples of both kinds of voting. They know very well, and Jen, you mentioned this earlier, when they declare victory early, and if you won, but people only find out 3 weeks or 2 months later, you've got the obligation to prove it, when in fact the facts may be on your side. So public education matters. You'll never reach the base. And for both sides, they're going to say they won and it was stolen and this happened over here. That happens every 4 years. I've been dealing with it still about 2016. But this year in particular, we have to prepare people, not talking about the doomsday scenarios, because that puts people off. Just giving them the facts about how this is going to work and how they're not going to get an election night again unless, as you said, there's a big margin. If there's a big margin, we'll know within 48, 72 hours, maybe even the wee hours after election night. But if it's close at all in key states, we could have election week, we could have election month, and I don't even want to think about anything beyond election month, because the Electoral College meets in mid-December, and has to send the votes to Congress, and they're counted in early January with the inauguration January 20th. Maybe we shouldn't have passed that constitutional amendment that took the swearing in from March 4th, and put it back to January 20th. We probably could have used the extra time this year.
You know, this election cycle, we've learned a lot of things that work, things that don't work. Iowa seems like it was forever ago, but there was a complete failure at the Iowa caucuses on the Democratic side of the aisle, and the party has already said that they're going to make major adjustments and perhaps get rid of the caucuses. We're beginning to see now that as a nation, we're not equipped to count the votes. You know, we always talk about how we should aim for 90 or 95% voter turnout. Can you imagine what would happen if 95% of people cast their ballots? As you know, there's discussion about the Electoral College and whether we should get rid of that. Are there broad lessons that could be helpful for democracy that we're learning this election cycle, despite the fact that every time we turn on the TV or read a newspaper article, we're hearing about the ways that democracy is failing? What are the silver linings of this, of all of these discussions and of beginning to understand what works and doesn't work?
Me or you?
I would push that to Larry, if that's okay with you. Sure. I'm interested in what Larry has to say.
Well, on the Electoral College, that is going to be abolished. People haven't followed this closely, but it'll be abolished, and I want you to circle the date on your calendar, the 12th of never. You can talk about how unfair it is, we got to rearrange this and that and the other, but the small states will never let that happen, never, because they get a lot of extra influence, and any state controlled by Republicans will never let that happen. So we can forget about that. But I do think the one thing we can work on in a bipartisan fashion that will have an impact is the counting of the vote, the method of casting votes and the counting of the votes. Jen, you mentioned something that I've argued for years and years, to have the absentee ballots opened in a bipartisan way. You always have partisan observers from both sides. Have them opened and ready to be tabulated, not tabulated in advance, because that'll leak out. We all know it will, one way or the other. So you just simply get them ready to tabulate. That saves a lot of time. Imagine opening all these envelopes and there are 2 envelopes to open. It takes a long time, and then you have to open the piece of paper and smooth it out. At least do that simple thing in advance. At least provide postage-free envelopes for absentees and mail-in ballots. It makes a big difference. People laugh and say, how can that make a difference? It makes a big difference. Pennsylvania's just gone to it. Virginia's just gone to it. We can do so many things to make a better system that aren't even partisan. Can't we get together on those things? And maybe that will create the foundation for changes that are more far-reaching.
So given the difficulties we've seen in terms of the processes of the election, the difficulties that we potentially will see when it comes to actually opening these ballots, what are your thoughts about prospects of governing? Assuming that Democrats hold the House and that it's likely that the presidency and the Senate will move in similar directions. If Joe Biden wins the presidency, it's hard to imagine, for example, that the Republicans hold the Senate. But regardless of the specific scenarios, we won't have a filibuster-proof Senate. So what are the prospects of governing moving forward? And we talk about how everything is at stake in this election. Is life going to look much different? I mean, and this can be on any sort of issue, or just what's your general sense? Like, is tone and civility really what's at stake when it comes to major change in Washington, or is it policy?
Policy, definitely policy. Look, let's suppose Democrats win the presidency by decent margin. I agree with you. That would almost certainly pull in a Democratic Senate, though it may be 50-50, with the tie broken by our new vice president if she is elected, Kamala Harris. That will be interesting to watch all by itself. And then the House would almost certainly stay Democratic, maybe adding seats, making it easier to put together a majority coalition. Well, what will Republicans do? They will do everything they can to preserve the filibuster. And I can guarantee you, and I mean guarantee, the activists on the Democratic side, that's first on the agenda. I mean, they got lots of policy issues, but the first thing is out with a filibuster, because there will be Supreme Court seats and other court seats. And the second factor is, we all know the probability is that Republicans will gain seats in 2022. I don't know whether they'll take over either house. Maybe they will. All right. You have to operate under that assumption. So it means that there are 2 years for Democrats to get things done. As with Obama, he only had 2 years. As with Clinton, he only had 2 years with the Democratic Congress. So you either act quickly and you cut red tape, and maybe you run roughshod over the minority and you run roughshod over some of the rules, but you get as much done as possible early on, because you can't count on another day in power. And the polarization is not going to dissipate because Joe Biden once worked with Republicans, most of whom, in fact, the vast majority of whom are now dead. So that's not going to happen. And they're going to have to make sure he understands that and doesn't waste time trying to woo this Republican and that Republican, because it's all going to fall apart. It's not going to happen. And he'll end up wasting months.
Yamiche, what is your impression of what governing will look like? Is it about, are the big changes going to be on policy? Are the big changes going to be the way that the White House would communicate with the media? I mean, what do you think of when you compare the way that the Trump White House has communicated with journalists versus whether it be a Democrat or Republican, but sort of previous presidents?
Yeah, I said it before. I mean, I think speculation is really Larry's job. I'm not someone who really looks at
Let me rephrase the question then. Let me rephrase the question then. Based on how you've seen the Biden campaign communicate with the media, what are the big differences in terms of how you get information from those two sides and how you're able to do your job as a journalist?
I mean, I think you're gonna see, I think the differences are obviously President Trump is kind of running on making Democrats and the media his opponents. And Joe Biden doesn't have that same rhetoric. I think that from the beginning of time, presidents and the media have always kind of had a tense relationship, because our job is to fact check and to hold elected officials accountable. I covered Bernie Sanders in 2016. Maybe people don't remember, but he also had times where he got frustrated with me for me asking questions about his healthcare plans, about all sorts of race issues. So I think that the idea that we're not going to have a robust back and forth between reporters, that's always, I think, going to be there. I think you're probably just not going to have Joe Biden just hasn't done the same thing in terms of attacking reporters personally and with nicknames in the way that President Trump has. But I think you're still going to have a real questioning of the motives of reporters, of whether or not stories were right. And we're still going to be fact checking an elected official.
So I have one short question and then one final question for the panel. The short, quickie one is, if right now you had to say what this was a year of, what has it been so far? We've had the year, in the past, we've had the year of the woman, the year of the soccer mom, it's the economy stupid. If you had to sort of say up until now what this election cycle has been, it's a year of the what?
Chaos.
Well, that's a good one. I would say year of division. This is a very divided America. It has been even predating Donald Trump. It has been reemphasized and certainly made worse in many ways by President Trump. He is, remember George W. Bush used to say, "I'm a uniter, not a divider." Well, President George W. Bush and most of the rest of us would agree, President Trump is a divider, not a uniter. It's the exact opposite of George W. Bush. And some people like that. Understand, some people like it because it makes very clear what the choices are, but nobody is ever going to convince me that it helps the United States of America to call people names and use dirty tactics and upset people constantly and cause turmoil by the hour, not the day or the week. No one will ever convince me of that. And I'm amazed that so many Americans seem to believe that it's a good thing.
And I say chaos because I think that we have just seen chaotic times, a pandemic that's upended the lives of everyone on the planet, race relations and racial reckoning with some of the most the most harrowing and terrible videos that I've ever seen as someone who's seen so many videos of police killings. The George Floyd video for 8 minutes and 46 seconds to watch a man's life be squeezed out of him, and an officer kneel with his hands in his pockets to kill somebody over an alleged counterfeit $20 bill. I think that really did something to the nation. I also think that we're in chaos because everything just seems to be unstable. We're sitting here, obviously not sitting next to each other because of all the things that are happening. I think division is an interesting choice. I think our nation has been divided for a long time. You bring up George W. Bush. I think of so many people who think of two things when they think of George W. Bush. They think of Hurricane Katrina, where African Americans felt like they were forgotten by their country and treated as refugees, and the war in Iraq, where people felt like there were thousands of Americans who gave their lives for a war that they don't quite understand why it was fought about. So I think that America has been divided for a long time. I think the issue is it's been more divided, I think, Larry, to your point, it has been even more entrenched of division. But I think the chaos is part of that. It's the fact that there are people who just don't know what day of the week it is. I wake up some days and I don't know if I'm coming or going because it's just everything's just so crazy. Everything is so crazy. Apart from politics, right? Personally, it's like, what day of the week is it? Do weekends even matter, right? Like, it's just I think the whole society is, I think, upended in some ways that we just haven't seen before.
On that happy note.
Very true.
Very true. Yeah, I mean, and I think that when people look around and they think about whether they should vote and how they should vote and whether their vote matters, all of those questions that are important in any election cycle become elevated this time around. And the logistics involved in being able to do that democratic thing and cast a ballot is more complicated than it's ever been. So thank you both so much for participating in this panel. Thank you to all of our participants who wrote in their questions. I tried to capture as many of them over the course of the last hour as I could. And if nothing else, make sure that you go out and vote. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Yamiche. Thank you, Larry. What a really great conversation and a great handoff to the next one. We heard some important words. Division and chaos to end. We also heard fireworks, facts, fraud, and factions. 2020 has already become a meme, with the premise being, could it get any worse? So if 2020 is actually hindsight, now we travel back in time for a look at past presidential races in times of crisis. In fact, it may not be a question of whether there are precedents, but rather which past elections provide lessons for the 2020 campaign. We've had political crises, we've had economic crises, and we've had racial reckonings in presidential election years before. So we have a legion of questions to ask and a terrific person to ask them alongside of two of the nation's foremost presidential historians. Our two guest historians are long friends of the Miller Center. In addition to having participated in a number of our programs over the years, they also provided guidance and counsel to the Miller Center several years ago, in fact, the year before I started. And their affirmation and recommendations for the center were part of my own transition and orientation here. So I'll start by thanking David and Margaret for that. Let me start with Professor Emeritus David Kennedy of Stanford University. David has authored several books, including one analyzing the United States as it grappled with two of the world's most pivotal crises, the Great Depression and World War II. David is renowned for his unique scholarship integrating economic and cultural analysis with the social and political history of the United States. He's been with us several times before, including most recently to discuss his new documentary, American Creed, which he produced with former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice on what it means to be an American. Margaret O'Mara is the Howard and Frances Keller Endowed Professor at the University of Washington. Prior to teaching at the University of Washington, Margaret has worked with the Department of Health and Human Services, the White House, and maybe most importantly to us, was a Miller Center National Fellow. She's written in particular about the presidency of Bill Clinton, in which she served and which I served. So I'm really delighted to have Margaret with us today. And like David, we've been lucky to have Margaret participate in a number of our past programs before. Her other books have been on technology, modern elections, and we're just delighted to have her. And to steer the conversation with Margaret and David, and hopefully share his own thoughts, is our own Sid Milkis. Sid is one of the Miller Center's most important members. He's the White Burkett Miller Professor of Governance at the Miller Center, as well as the Cavaliers Distinguished Teaching Professor in the Department of Politics here at UVA. He's also the author of numerous books, including the co-author of the leading textbook on the American presidency. His most recent book is Rivalry and Reform: Presidents, Social Movements, and the Transformation of American Politics. So I'm delighted to have my friend and partner here at the Miller Center, Sid Milkis, lead us through the next hour. Sid, over to you.
Thank you, Bill. Good to see you. Welcome, Margaret and David. It's such a pleasure to see you. I wish we were sitting by each other, but it's good to see you virtually. I want to welcome our audience, those of you who are joining us for the second panel, those who are continuing from the first panel. And we welcome your engagement. Please ask any questions that come to mind through the Q&A feature on your screen. So I thought I would just start with a general question that Bill alluded to. And I'll start with you, Margaret, and then we'll turn to David. What elections in our past, Margaret, do you think shed the most useful light in helping us understand the 2020 election?
Well, thanks. And thanks. It's really great to be here. I think that with, comparison is always imperfect. There are things about this this year that stand apart from others, this chaos election, as the previous panel discussed. But I think there are some useful parallels. And so I actually, being a good history professor, I brought some visual aids. So I wanted to kick us off very briefly and go back to a period we've been talking quite a bit about in this year of pandemic and protest, which is a century ago, the election of 1920, which of course comes right after the pandemic, the influenza pandemic of 1918 and many other things. And so I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully this will be a nice, clean, let's see, let's go. Okay, it's not on the slideshow yet. It's on the, sorry guys. Here we go, start my slideshow. Okay, there we go. So the one thing that really struck me as I was thinking about this was, what we're dealing with right now is we kind of ricochet from crisis to crisis in the last year, right? We have, just think about what's happened since January. It's just mind blowing. Information overload, emotional overwhelm. And I think that 1920 was very much the same. I mean, think about all the things that occurred in just the 24 months before the election. So in 1918, November 1918, the armistice ends World War I. Woodrow Wilson begins his great and ultimately failed campaign to persuade the U.S. to join the League of Nations to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. 1918 and 1919, you have the Great Influenza, a pandemic that kills over 500,000 Americans and millions around the world, more than 10 times the number of American soldiers who died in combat in World War I. And what I've been struck actually in the last several months is the degree to which we historians have not talked about the Great Influenza or integrated it into our analysis of what happens in the end of World War I, 1919, 1920. It's this interesting, something that we haven't, I think going forward, it's going to be very interesting to think about how we talk about it more differently, not just recognizing that it happened, but thinking about what its political and social impact might have been. And then we have, things like the ratification of the 18th Amendment, where we have prohibition, prohibiting the sale and distribution of alcohol, this great progressive reform victory, the banning of alcohol, an extraordinarily contentious social issue. We forget how much this loomed large and was such a divisive issue in American politics through the 1920s and into the 1930s. In fact, in the 1932 election, the two parties thought the main, deciding factor in who was going to win the presidency was going to be prohibition and ending prohibition, whether one was wet or dry, were the real sort of defining factors. And I know that Professor Kennedy will probably speak a little bit more to that moment. And then there is great protest and unrest. There is worker solidarity. There are great fears of rising socialism. There's a general strike. And here in my town of Seattle in February 1919, more than 60,000 workers go out on strike in solidarity. The entire city shuts down. Other massive labor actions in 1919 in the wake of the end of World War I. And of course, this is happening 2 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, in which many Americans are deeply worried that that sort of revolution will come to America. It is a very inequitable economy. There's a great deal of worker mobilization and labor radicalism, and great dissatisfaction with, rightfully so, with the inequities of industrial capitalism. And then there is policing and racial violence. The 1919 was famously known as the Red Summer, where we have riots in, among other places, the south side of Chicago, where a young, is set off by a young African-American boy, goes swimming in Lake Washington, pelted with stones. Sorry, Lake Washington, I'm thinking Seattle. In Lake Michigan, is pelted with rocks by some white teenagers on the shore, dies, and this sets off a conflagration that ends in death of both white and black Chicagoans. And then we have an election that comes after this, all of this cascade of things, in which Warren Harding, the Republican challenger, is campaigning on a return to normalcy, coming back from the U.S. engagement in World War I, from this and all of these other, while the war and the question of the U.S., whether the U.S. was going to become part of the League of Nations, was going to engage with the world or turn inward, was really the driving force in the 1920 election. Nonetheless, this backdrop of pandemic, of protest, of all of these things are shaping a collective desire, something that propels Warren Harding to the White House, elected by the largest majority to date to that point in U.S. elections, who is promising a kind of laissez-faire, let's go back to the way things were, let's end this engagement with the world, and let us try and clamp things down. And what comes in the wake of 1920, I think, is also worthwhile to think about. An election is not a singular event. It doesn't solve everything. Things don't go away, and nor does it change everything. The Harding presidency, we can, not one of our more successful presidencies, we shall say, but the underlying conditions that drive so many Americans to vote for someone who's promising something, to kind of let all this, to end this chaos, so to speak, does not make the chaotic conditions go away. You have an era of great prosperity, new affluence for some, the so-called Roaring Twenties that some of America enjoyed, but also the underlying anxieties and inequities and inward turn does not go away. You have a rise of nativism, of nationalism. The second Ku Klux Klan, takes hold and has a broad national membership that is not only anti-Black, but particularly anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant. You have immigration restrictionism, which has kind of reached a new momentum, is gathered in the 19 teens to restrict foreign immigration, partially because of the fear of socialism and Bolshevism, but it also is part of this. Here we have a changing media environment, a changing economic environment, and this propels an inward turn. And I show pictures like this to my students of, here's a march of the Ku Klux Klan in Richmond, California, in the Bay Area, just to remind everyone that this is not something isolated to a particular region of the country, but was something that was national and tapped into a national economic anxiety and racism that was not restricted to just the South. And inequities persist, and the fundamental inequalities that characterize the economy of the 1920s, of course, make this very rickety foundation that when the global depression hits in the late 1920s and early 30s, makes the house of cards fall down quite quickly. And so while some Americans, particularly white Americans living in metropolitan areas, had new rising incomes and new freedoms with new technologies like the automobile, you also had the persistence of Jim Crow segregation in the South. You had a great deal of rural poverty, the vast majority of rural Americans living under the poverty line, living without adequate infrastructure. And so the elections can be pivotal, and they can be these moments that help us understand what's going on and where broader anxieties come to a head, but they do not change everything. But I think there's a lot to learn from this earlier moment and understanding how all this confluence of crises can shape what might happen in November. So I'll leave it with that.
Well, thank you so much, Margaret. The last panel was talking about, as you mentioned, the chaos of our own time and the crises we face. And a lot of times when we're going through a crisis, we think it's the worst time ever. And I think it's really important that you remind us about this period of the first couple of decades of the 20th century, which were really disruptive. And it's particularly notable to take a look at what happened after that landslide election of 1920, that there was no return to normalcy. And former Vice President Biden I think he's actually talked about a sort of return to normalcy. And we can talk about this more as the conversation develops, but I don't think any of us really expect we're going to have a return to normalcy after this election. So there's lots of stuff to dig into there, but why don't I turn to David and get your reflections, David, on some history that would help us understand what's going on.
Well, thanks, and thank you, Margaret, for that reminder of just how tumultuous the moment of 1920, that immediate post-World War I era was. You make me think of a famous remark of Mark Twain's, that is difference of opinion that makes for a good horse race. So I'm going to offer a slightly different opinion about this. 1920 was the first election in which my father was of an age where he could vote for a presidential candidate. And he did not vote for Warren G. Harding. But there's another larger lens here through which we might look at this. And for all the drama that you've just reminded us of, Margaret, the fact is that the election of 1920 happened in despite all the things you just reminded us of, a kind of normal political context. And that context was fairly stable from 1896 to 1932. It was a period of Republican dominance of the federal system, all branches of it. And the Wilson presidency was a kind of an anomaly in all of that. Elected originally in 1912 only because the Republican Party temporarily split. Re-elected barely in 1916. Some people think because Hiram Johnson refused to shake Charles Evans Hughes' hand when Hughes campaigned in California. And of course, as you know, Margaret, of course, the Democratic Party lost the Congress in 1918, which would foreshadow what happened at the presidency in 1920. So from the late 1890s to the New Deal period of the 1930s, this was a Republican country with the anomalous interruption of the Wilsonian presidency. And not only have historians failed to connect the pandemic to electoral behavior in 1920, a lot of the other things you talked about don't seem to have significantly moved the needle of this long 3+ decades period of Republican dominance. If I asked my father to repeat the first presidential election he voted in was 1920, was there an election where he thought the character of the country had fundamentally changed, he would have instantly replied 1932. When it ends a period of Republican dominance, initiates a period of Democratic dominance that lasts, you could argue about it, probably till 1968. And that's just a singular fact of life that dominates the whole political system for decades on end. So the contrast, it seems to me, with today is that we don't live in a period of when one or the other party has long-term hegemony over the political culture and the political system. If anything, the moment we've been living through for the last couple of decades or so reminds me of the late 19th century, when no party could manage to dominate the system for more than a few years at a time. Lots of so-called swing elections where the dominant party in one or the other chambers of the legislature changed election by election. No party could stay in the presidency for more than one or two administrations in a row. A period of great instability in the system, and that's where we are today, it seems to me, where new constituencies can be recruited into the electorate, where the loyalties of some constituencies are no longer as firmly established as they were in a prior generation. So for all the drama of 1920, I would say that was a kind of normal election in a long-term stable period. And where we sit today looks entirely different to me.
But as Margaret pointed out, David, that normal period had a great deal of disruption. She talked about the nativism, the 1924 anti-immigration law, the most nativist law we've passed in America, which put quotas on everyone except those who came from Northern and Western Europe. The Klan emerged with a vengeance. There was lynchings when Crow settled in. So perhaps it's not a horrible thing that we're not as settled in to a pattern.
Well, fair enough. My point is simply that these issues that we focus on because they have great drama and they remind us of the volatility and I dare say the imperfections in our collective life, they didn't seem to get as directly politicized in ways that disrupted the functioning of the larger political system, as is true today. It's just, I think we live in a very different political environment. The role of the political parties is not what it used to be. Parties used to be the mechanisms by which candidates were recruited and vetted and put forward by party bosses, the famous smoke-filled room metaphor, of course. Parties were organizations that educated the public, and people had confidence in them, and their loyalties to parties were fairly stable. Parties don't do that anymore. Now everybody is a political entrepreneur who can rent or buy or hijack a party and do what he or she wants. Now, Joe Biden is not that kind of candidate, but Donald Trump certainly has been. And the parties are one of the many institutions in American life that just don't have the role they used to have.
Yeah, I mean, party conventions really meant something then. Party organizations really made
the last convention that went to a second ballot, Sid, you probably know this better than anybody here, was 1952. Yeah. And Adlai Stevenson in the Democratic Party. We have not, I was a delegate to the 2000 convention, Democratic convention, Staples Center in Los Angeles. And I have to tell you from firsthand experience, it was not a political gathering in any kind of conventional sense. It was a gigantic infomercial in which all kinds of interests presented themselves and wanted to be represented in front of the party bigwigs and so on. But no convention has really played a dispositive role in choosing a candidate for decades.
Yeah. I mean, since we went to the primary system, and that's really put in place in the 70s, we've got candidate-centered campaigns. And the conventions are merely to celebrate the candidate and the candidate's family. And it is not really a collective, an event of collective responsibility as it once was. Margaret, let me go back to this, the period of 1920. And let's talk a little bit about Woodrow Wilson and his leadership during the pandemic, which broke out in 1918. Although Wilson was not on the ballot in 1920, it was really a referendum on his leadership, particularly regarding the League of Nations. On the ballot was James Cox, governor of Ohio, and Franklin Roosevelt became a rising star in 1920. About the only good thing for the Democratic campaign in that year, the only positive sign was the rise of Franklin Roosevelt as the vice presidential candidate. But what can you tell us about Wilson and his leadership? during this disruptive period that before we got this landslide in 19.
Yeah. Well, on the pandemic itself, there's some striking parallels in terms of where the national leadership was absent. Obviously, this was a time in which the national government itself was much smaller. The federalism sort of functioned in a different way. The states and localities were more important. A public health infrastructure as it existed was entirely state and local, and it still has a localism that persists to this day for good reason. But really, the Wilson administration's stance was similar to other leaders around the world, was to just ignore it and pretend it wasn't happening for a while. And there was not a national mobilization. There was not a response. And interestingly, thinking again, I've been thinking more about kind of how we grapple with, think about the pandemic in the context of the way we think about the late 19 teens and the way that we teach about it and the way that we write about it. And one of the things, of course, the term of art used and embraced by American politicians was that the influenza was called the Spanish flu, because the government of Spain, the King of Spain, was the only one who acknowledged that this was actually happening, even though it's likely that the influenza began in a military camp in Kansas. So it was the American flu. But the foreignness of it, the foreignness of the influenza and the great devastation it wrought, I think is a piece of this great, this larger suspicion of the foreign. And of course, Wilson himself kind of personally campaigns and goes on a great barnstorming tour that when he was already in bad health, and this clearly precipitated his stroke and his downward spiral in health from there on out, to ultimately a fruitless attempt to convince the Senate to ratify the Treaty of Versailles by a 2/3 majority, and to do it on the terms in which Wilson would like it to be ratified. And David can speak in much more robust detail about the precision of that. But I think it's an interesting, I think looking at we again have to think about that pandemic and understand how American governance and politics was working back then. But this is an interesting kind of going back to what we were talking about parties. The other thing that I'm thinking a lot about this year is how this, we talk in terms of, the courts and parties of the 19th century, and how the American state was shaped by that, and how the parties were rightfully so important. And the conventions were where everything happened. It was as if the entire electoral process that we drip out over 24 months all happened in 1 week of a convention in the 19th century. And whoever, and that's why when I think in the, okay, can I talk about the 19th century presidents in order? I think the people on this webinar will be better at it, but really it's hard to remember, right? We have a lot of one-termers. It's partially because the parties were more important. And so thinking back to our first hour, in which the panelists were talking about how, if you have a D or an R in front of your name, that's going to determine whether you get a vote or not. And people are deciding on party. And so if you go back 100 years, you have the time of Wilson and the time of Harding and time of Teddy Roosevelt is the emergence of candidate-centered politics, where the parties are becoming less important, where media is defining the race much more so than it used to be. And now, interestingly, we have both candidate-centered. I mean, the Republican Party is the party of Donald Trump. And yet, partisanship, we have 90+% of people kind of in their trenches, and that's who they're going to vote for. And so this is very intriguing, kind of contextualizing how, what is the role of the particular candidate, and how much can a particular presidential nominee move the needle? And really, how are we becoming, with parties themselves actually as bodies not having as much power, but party identification having so much power? How do we, what sort of moment is this that we're in?
Yeah, it's interesting now, and this is a paradox I've been trying to figure out, that we have, as David was saying, very weak party organizations right now, but we have heightened partisanship, and I can give reasons for why those seeming contradictory things are occurring, partly because parties were kind of screening devices that would filter some of the harsh partisan conflict for better and worse, as we were suggesting. But David, I wonder what your thoughts are on partisanship then and partisanship now. And
Well, again, let me once again, this suggests a little bit of a different lens through which we might see this, especially this earlier moment. The fact is that on the record, as Margaret has just reminded us, Woodrow Wilson had little or nothing to say about the pandemic of 1918, and there was little or no federal mobilization to counteract it. But there's some specific historical circumstances to remember there. I mean, the first presentation of the flu as a possible pandemic only comes in the early fall of 1918, just as World War I is winding down, and Wilson, of course, is preoccupied with the conclusion of the war, and then he loses control of the Congress in November 1918, and he goes off to the peace negotiations. So suffice it to say, he had some other things on his mind. But there's another larger consideration here, I think, that informs our deeper historical understanding of this. And it is that the federal government, if you take as a rough and ready measure of the role of the federal government in our national life, the amount of tax revenue that flows through the federal system. Today, it's about 20% of GDP or of national income flows through the federal government. In Wilson's day, it was about 2 to 3%. The federal government was just a much lesser institution or array of institutions than it later became. So among the reasons that the Wilson administration didn't do much about the pandemic was that it didn't have many institutions in place with which it could mobilize. And that remains true up into the 1930s, when the whole architecture and scale of the federal establishment does begin to change quite dramatically. So here's another, Sid, you just used the word paradox. Here's another one. The federal government expands rather remarkably beginning in the 1930s, but the real expansion comes later, the post-World War II period, when now the federal government is responsible for roughly 20% of GDP in terms of tax revenue. And the presidency becomes more and more the place where we focus our attention in the media and as voters and so on, because allegedly the president presides over this big federal establishment. But because we have divided government, presidents are often checked by not having a majority in the legislature. And chronically, presidential promises of this and that and the other thing that they're going to accomplish get frustrated. So it seems to me the last couple of decades have exposed some structural, I'll call them again, architectural deficiencies in our constitutional system, where we have higher and higher expectations about what the federal government can and should do, but still remaining almost two and a half centuries later, constitutional constraints on what the federal executive can actually accomplish. Parliamentary systems, that's a different story, but we don't have a parliamentary system. So we live in a system where we're constitutionally constrained to be eternally frustrated.
Yeah, there's been a really dangerous manifestation of that kind of limitation of divided government and the combination of divided government and polarization, and that is presidents are not satisfied to do nothing when their ambitions or their party's ambitions are frustrated. They try to pursue their objectives through executive action, unilateral action. I think Donald Trump has had a tremendous influence on immigration policy. There's been a dramatic departure since the Obama administration. And yet all of that has been done through unilateral action, in large part because some of the laws delegate so much responsibility. So I think one of the takeaways of this phenomenon you're discussing is we suffer from dangerous executive aggrandizement. We have before, surely, Woodrow Wilson engaged in it, but it seems to be a routine way of governing now, which I think has constitutional consequences.
Sid, as you know, Margaret, you do too, a generation or so ago, there was a lot of discussion amongst historians and political scientists about the role of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court had to take the lead on a lot of social issues, civil rights prominent amongst them, at least the 1950s. Think of the Brown versus Topeka decision, because the other two branches of the government were incapable of acting. Well, that discussion about the peculiar characteristics of our system is now migrated to what you're just talking about, Sid. It's executive orders are now the pathway to getting something done, where it used to be judicial decision making. But now the executive branch, frustrated in the legislature, governs through executive order, which are legally dubious and also quite vulnerable. The next executive can reverse the order.
Yeah, yeah,
Look at Bear's ears.
yeah. Which contributes to the chaos that we've been talking about for the last hour and a half. I want to pivot to a question from a member of our audience. Gary wants us ask the question: what other elections besides 1920 can be considered crisis or chaos elections? He often points to 1800, 1824, 1860, and even 1968. Are there other elections we should be talking about, Margaret, in this conversation?
Yes. I mean, we have 1800, 1824. You have the decision that we don't know who the president is until February, right? Goes to the House. 1876. That it isn't decided until days before inauguration in March of 1877, and there's and this is a tremendously consequential election because it ends Reconstruction. And ends the federal military occupation of the South that was protecting the Reconstruction Amendments, enforcing the Reconstruction Amendments, begins Jim Crow. 1860 for sure. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about 1860, because and I'm sure, David, you get these a lot. I have a lot of people kind of worriedly coming up to me saying, are we in the 1850s and what's going to, are we on the verge of
a civil war? Yeah.
Yeah, another civil war. So here's what's interesting to me. So Lincoln kind of, not the choice of most of the voters. I mean, he kind of gets, ends up being but he gets a resounding victory, in part because the Democrats themselves are split sectionally. But thinking about who the South was, let's call them the Never Lincolns, or so they were a coherent and very powerful political and economic system. One of the reasons that the South, the Confederacy won so many battles is they had all the generals. You end up with some, the U.S., the Union ended up with a guy, U.S. Grant, who'd been, drummed out of the military a decade before because he had in part because he had a drinking problem, and kind of pulled out a victory out of defeat ultimately. But it had, incredible amount of political power. One reason slavery, that the way that their antebellum period played out is that Congress was, the slave power. The Southerners had so much power in the legislative branch, and an incredible amount of economic power, although it was very concentrated at the top. And so I think that's a contrast between, who would be, if there is if for some reason the way this plays out and we end up with, one side or another, the Trump, certainly the base that the president is currently kind of encouraging and inciting and leaning into is not necessarily where the power lies in the same way that the South. And I'm sort of interested in both what both of you think about that. But I've been thinking, again, trying to be thoughtful about how do we draw out these contrasts. But certainly the more modern period, we have other tumultuous elections, 68, and 2000 for that matter, decided by the Supreme Court. But they all have, I think there's salient differences that are worth, that should give us pause. We shouldn't sort of rush too quickly to say, well, this is what's going to happen again.
Yeah, in the last panel, there was a discussion. Well, what happens if we don't have a verdict on election day? What's going to play out? Well, 2000, we had quite a passion play that went on for several weeks. So we have some event to look back to get a sense of what that might look like with all the lawyers, the battalion of lawyers coming in, and the court getting involved. David, did you want to comment on some?
Well, just a couple of things. 2000 was trauma enough, but the problem was concentrated in one state, Florida. And this time around, you may have comparable situations in half a dozen or more states. So the dimensions of possible chaos, it seems to me, are even larger than 2000, bad enough as that was. But I'd say go back to what Margaret was discussing about the 1860 and the Civil War situation. There's another obvious difference between then and now. Margaret, I'm sure this happens to you. It happens to all historians, I suppose, that people say, have we ever been as divided as we are today? Well, yeah, there's an obvious answer to that. Yes, 1860, we killed 700,000 of each other. We were so divided in a full-blown civil war. But the difference between that moment and this, among the many, many differences, is that is implicit in what you just said, Margaret, but the South also had territorial integrity. It was a geographically describable entity that had its own internal channels of communication and transportation and so on and so forth. Today's divisions don't have that kind of really sharp geographical delineation. So if we, God forbid, but if we approach something like Civil War circumstances today, it would be a much more fragmented, chaotic, really difficult situation because it would not have that territorial dimension that the 1860s did.
1864 is interesting because there was some discussion earlier on, which seems to have been squelched, about whether the election might be postponed. The president made some allusions to that possibility. And Lincoln was the first president really faced with whether to have an election during a period of war and a domestic rebellion, nevertheless. And there was some pressure from his fellow Republicans to postpone the election, particularly because it looked like until Sherman made some progress in the South that Lincoln could lose that election. But Lincoln thought it was important to have it. And even there was even action to make sure that soldiers would be able to vote. I think this is the first time we actually had something resembling mail-in ballots from
That's right.
soldiers. So, so it's hard to imagine an election with more pressure than we faced in 1964, where there was really strong, even though the South was not involved in that election, there was the Copperheads, there was really strong resistance in the North. And yet it was an election that was resolved peacefully in the North, and Lincoln was reelected, and the crisis, the immediate electoral crisis, at least, subsided after the election.
Yeah, and that's some kind of testimony at that time, at least, to the resilience of democratic institutions. And I think you're right that had not Sherman raised all that mayhem in Georgia, McClellan may very well have won the election of 1864, and the Southern bid to negotiate a settlement preserving slavery and so on might very well have gone forward. So, yeah, that's a really crucial election. And you think as well of World War II, when this country held elections in wartime. One of our partners in the Grand Alliance, Great Britain, suspended elections during wartime. The mother of all democracies did not go to the ballot box. Japan had elections during World War II, our adversary. But so we've held elections in very, very fraught and conflicted moments, and that ought to give us some reassurance, I guess, that we have some precedent for doing it again now.
Yeah. I think Lincoln, as far as I could tell, was plotting a bit with Frederick Douglass to get as many. They had some when things looked dark about winning the election. They had some plans that were brewing to get as many slaves to the North as possible before the election occurred, because it was clear that if McClellan won, the Emancipation Proclamation would be null and void. It wouldn't work. So again, there is some comfort to know it's hard to imagine an election more fraught than 1864 yet.
I agree.
Yeah. I will going back to David's earlier observation about executive power. I think there's also, something we should keep in mind as we make these historical comparisons is one, the relative size of the federal government to GDP, and then executive power. And of course, one of the things I remind my students of, the presidents you remember from the 19th century are usually the ones that enlarge the power of the executive. Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln. And one of the things Lincoln does between 1860 and 1864 which is very easy to do when your entire opposition, the opposing political party, secedes from the Union, is you get a lot of major federal legislation, there's state building going on. There's the Railroad Act, there's the Homestead Act, there's the Morrill Act, which establishes land grant universities. But I think in contrast, kind of picking up on David's comment about World War II as the time, that this is the pivot point in which state, the real modern state building happens, is that one enlargement of the executive, and one thing that underlies the ability of modern presidents in the 21st century to do so much by executive order, in addition to trying to get around Congress that doesn't agree with them, is national security and the national security state. And the great degree to which, the presidency is the very kind of limited way that the Constitution constructs the presidency is kind of that puts that in his corner. But of course, that was at a time when the US was a teeny tiny little power being swatted around by the big European powers, and it was not an international superpower. And so I think that's also something that lies behind, how we think about these elections functioning, and the power particularly the power of the incumbent to shape, to use the power of his or her office to shape what to kind of use that in a way that advantages him electorally. And it is quite different from before.
Yeah, I mean, presidents didn't campaign
No.
in the 19th century. One thing different in the 19th century, when presidents gained a lot of power, it was usually temporary. And I mean, of course, there was the presidency was weakened with a vengeance after Lincoln's assassination. Under Andrew Johnson, the Congress took command of the country in a way that might be the height of congressional government, and in large part a reaction to the extensions of executive power Lincoln had taken. Particularly the suspension of habeas corpus was very controversial. I wondered, David, if you'd talk a little bit about the Great Depression and World War II and Franklin Roosevelt, because there haven't been comparisons. There have been contrasts between FDR and Trump, but people talk about Hoover and Trump as representing some parallels we might think about.
Well, frankly said, I haven't seen a lot of comparisons between Hoover and Trump, but nonetheless, if of all the people who've been president, I suppose it's fair to say 3 might have filled out that line in their census form about what's their occupation. They might have filled it out as businessman. And Hoover would be one of those, and Jimmy Carter might be a second, and Donald Trump might be a third. So if that's the case, some kind of achievement in the business sphere does not appear to be a very strong qualification for a successful presidency. But nonetheless, Hoover was a kind of normal political and cultural figure who got walloped by a crisis the likes of which and the scale and velocity of which nobody had seen before. So I've always had a certain amount of sympathy for him. He's a failed presidency, don't get me wrong. But nonetheless, when the Democratic Party hired that publicist, Charles Mickelson, to pin the responsibility for the Depression on Hoover in the campaign of '32, they created a political image that has persisted now for almost a century that I think is essentially unfair. But that's a kind of a fine inside baseball historiographical point, you might say.
Yeah.
But look, here's another point that's kind of curious about 1932. So there's 13 million people unemployed in a population of about 120 or 30 million people. That's 25% of the workforce. The workforce at that time was overwhelmingly male. Fewer than 10% of married women worked for wages as of the census of 1930. So when we talk about 25% unemployment, we're essentially talking about 23 or 4% of all households, families, are without a source of income. So it's deeply distressed time. And yet Franklin Roosevelt remarked, and one of his brain trusters, Rexford Tugwell, reports this in his memoir, that Roosevelt, and he was not alone in this, Roosevelt remarked on the campaign trail how it was a puzzle to him how the American people were so docile and so passive in the face of this gigantic calamity. And we know from some detailed social psychological research done in the 1930s, especially by a woman by the name of Mira Komorowski, that people typically reacted to the depression, to their circumstance of being unemployed, by feeling guilty and ashamed and personally responsible for their circumstance. When we might say, looking at them through the historical lens, that in fact they were part of a massive social and economic breakdown. It wasn't their personal fault that they found themselves in this predicament. So what's the point here? It is that at that moment in time, in the 1930s, the general public's expectation that the federal government in particular was capable of, or had any business, in fact, doing anything about this crisis, was actually very, very small and minimal. Something has changed between then and now. We now reflexively think that the federal government has a responsibility to counterpunch to a crisis like, for example, the Great Recession 2008-9 or the pandemic today. But our you might say the schedule of our political and cultural values has shifted from that generation to this, and we now have an expectation that the federal government will be an effective agent of our collective welfare to a degree that simply wasn't true as the Great Depression began. It's true maybe by the end of that decade, but not at the front end.
Do you think Roosevelt's presidency and the New Deal program and the kind of new social contract that Roosevelt articulated was a critical moment of transformation?
Yes, and I think you've used the right term, social contract. One of these things that's difficult, if not impossible, to quantify, and it's a little bit of an elusive concept. But I do think that it's quite observable that the American citizenry's expectations of what government's role is and should be changed dramatically over the course of that decade and is different today from what it was then. To make it specific, look at what happened in 2008, 2009, the Great Recession comes. There's no 3-4 years of debate as there was in 1929, 30, 31, and 32 about whether the government had a role to play at all. And if so, what should it look like? No debate like that. Both the outgoing Bush administration and the incoming Obama administration, 2008, 2009, were reflexively prepared and did counterpunch to the Great Recession. And there was little or no controversy about that at the time. Some controversy lingers thereafter about whether the measures taken were the best of all imaginable ones. But it was a given that the federal government had the means and had the obligation to try to stop this crisis in its tracks. And essentially they did. No such consensus existed on the ground in 1930, 31, 32. And that's why part of the role of the New Deal historically is to change the culture's orientation or attitude toward these kinds of questions about the role of government.
So I wonder if you, and I'd like to hear you and Margaret comment on whether you think, we have this cascade of crises now, a public health crisis, an economic crisis, a racial reckoning. And I wonder if you guys think any kind of transformation may come out of this election, or are we just too intractably divided to see that kind of change?
Margaret?
Your mentor.
I think a lot about 1932, which did change that. So you have, what the Great Depression does is, and why Hoover was, as David rightly observes, was very accomplished, was considered one of the most admired men in America when he was, a very good manager and very good at logistics and, getting things done. And it really, the scope and the scale of the Great Depression and the multiple kind of complex causality of it kind of breaks the rules, kind of the way that the United States had kind of gotten used to adjusting to panics and kind of making it through the volatility of capitalism. It created an opening and a space for all of these ideas that already had been, running around reform circles for decades and being implemented at the state and local level. All of a sudden, there's political space. The aperture of political possibility opens. And 2020 holds the possibility for that. It has I think the confluence of multiple crises in a way, and the way in which, the nature of protest and the way that it has played out. I think there are a lot of trajectories this could take. And we're seeing both And I think the other kind of thing that creates an inherent unpredictability, and as you guys know, I write and think a lot about the technology industry, is the media environment in which we're existing, which is not just a matter of new media. We've had new media before that's redefined politics. But the nature of the kind of information overload that's inherent to the current media environment, and the ability for groups from the political fringe, say, for example, the far right and white supremacists, to mobilize and to get visibility get national visibility in a way that they were unable to. And this kind of decentering of truth, and that's coupled with a distrust in established institutions, that's something that's different. But I feel like 2020, I don't know. I mean, David, I don't know if you agree with this, but I feel that in the future editions of the American Pageant, the textbook on which David and I both work, we will see 2020 as perhaps the end of one part and the beginning of another. One of those moments in which, but we don't know yet. It's a little too soon to tell. But this does have a kind of common, I sense. Again, there have been a lot of things out in the political atmosphere that now that perhaps the aperture of political possibility is opening. This will, of course, depend a lot on what happens in November and then the ultimate resolution of that election.
David?
Yeah, and I'm afraid it also depends on in which direction the aperture opens. Let's not be too cocky or presumptuous about what the outcome is going to be. So if it's a turning point or an inflection point of some kind, whether it goes left, right, or otherwise, I wouldn't be confident in predicting at this moment in time. And despite what I just said about the expansion of the federal presence and the general public's acceptance of the legitimacy of federal initiative, we have proven, again, divided government being, I think, a big piece of the explanation, along with polarization and sorting of people into the two parties that now regard each other as mortal and existential threats to one another. We've just been incapable of doing what a lot of other societies have done reasonably well in the last decade or two or three. The fact that we are the only advanced industrial or post-industrial society without some kind of universal health care is a direct function of the nature of the political system we live in. That we can't do anything about arms control, even though, gun control domestically, despite the fact that overwhelming majorities of public opinion polls support some kind of initiative in that direction. And despite the drama of those students protesting, demonstrating after the shooting in Florida, for example, a couple of years ago, everybody thought that would be an inflection point. Well, where's that gone? And we have a great deal of difficulty, given our system and the cultural moment we're in, addressing these issues on which there is some level of basic consensus that something ought to be done, but it doesn't get done. And of course, the trump card, pardon the expression, in all of that kind of discussion is climate change, which is a existential threat of the first caliber, but it's off in the future, and trading present day or short-term interests against long-term interests makes it very, very difficult to do anything. And we don't have a political system that really is geared to take on that kind of issue.
We have a question here from Dana that puts a fine point on the possible diminishment of the legitimacy of our democratic institutions. She asks, are there other examples in history where there was concern that a sitting president would not leave the White House if he lost his re-election bid? Have we ever had that?
Think of one in our country. I honestly can't. I suppose you could stretch the point and talk about Franklin Roosevelt's running for a third term in 1940, which was controversial.
Yes.
There was a constitutional amendment in place at that time to prohibit such a thing, but there was a norm inherited in the legacy of George Washington, of course, that 2 terms was it. And that was a very controversial point. And the Wendell Willkie campaigned actively against what he called the third termite. That is Franklin Roosevelt, who was violating this norm that had been in place for well over a century. And in fact, polling data suggests that had it not been for the fall of France in June of 1940, and the threat of an ever larger and widening world war, which would inevitably involve the United States, if it had not been for that circumstance, Roosevelt may very well have lost the election of 1940. He won it by the smallest margin of any of his elections. So that's about as close as I can come to an example of a president who was not prepared to leave office. But that was all constitutionally okay and proceeded normally. A president physically refusing to leave the Oval Office because he wouldn't accept the results of an election, I don't think we have an example of that.
Margaret?
Yeah, and I think what makes it difficult is that Donald Trump is in many ways exceptional. We have always, Americans have always been drawn to the change candidate. Change usually wins modern elections, person who's promising to change things. But we only in 2016 did we have a change candidate who was really willing to sort of turn the entire table over and then governed as such. And in 1968, which is another frequently invoked chaos election, and there are some interesting parallels, but I think one distinctive difference is in 1968 you had Hubert Humphrey, who was essentially running as the incumbent or a continuation of the same, and running on, unfortunately for him, Lyndon Johnson's record in Vietnam. And you had Richard Nixon, who was, yes, indeed, running on themes of law and order and some things that echo into 2020. But you also had George Wallace, who did not win the presidency, did not win, but did win a big, nice, healthy chunk of the Deep South, and was sort of taking that kind of unadulterated populist message, and pushing and really playing hard to a base in a way that echoes through in some of Donald Trump's rhetoric. But we haven't had kind of the someone who's promising extreme change win, and someone who's willing to break so many rules, from including last Thursday at the White House, having a campaign rally on the South Lawn. And so this, I think, makes our ability as historians we reach a limit at a certain point, because there's only so far we can go to look in our crystal ball or look backwards and say, aha, we have seen this before, and this is how we can go forward.
Let me ask you,
I dare say, Sid, excuse me, but history is an empirical discipline, and we're pretty scrupulous about the reliability and authenticity of the data we use, and we have no data from the future by definition. So try to avoid the predictions.
Yeah. My colleague Jen Lawless, who's more data driven than I, might have some future data, but I can't help. I just wanted to ask one last question. We're running out of time, and I want to bring a question from Edward, who asked about 1968, but focuses particularly on the urban riots, what was going on in the streets. And this has become the center of this election, at least for now. And I wonder if you both would kind of comment on how you think this is going to play out. This in a way, this battle over between Trump and Biden as to which of them can best respond to this racial reckoning, and the questions about policing that have emerged as such a dramatic part of this election.
Well, it's an apt comparison, I believe, to summon that moment of 1968 into this conversation because of the kind of obvious parallels. There's no question, but again, as Margaret reminded us about 1920, in 1968, there are a lot of things going on. There's the war in Vietnam, which by that time is deeply unpopular. There's all the sequelae to the civil rights movement and civil rights legislation of earlier in that decade. And then there's the rioting and civil disturbances in many American cities in 1968, not to mention assassinations. But and certainly Richard Nixon, part of the wave that propelled him to the White House is composed of people's deep anxiety about those urban disruptions. But there are a lot of other things in that equation, so it's hard to tease out that one particular factor. But yes, in my mind at least, I'm sure in the minds of many others, the way that the Nixon exploited that to his electoral advantage suggests something similar happening today. And in fact, one of the president's spokespersons, Kellyanne Conway, all but said publicly the other day that the more disruption there is, the better it is for the Trump campaign. I'm paraphrasing her, but the words to that effect.
Yeah.
Margaret?
Well, and what we're seeing this year, I think, is the, 1968, we never resolved the things that were bringing people to the streets,
Yeah.
that in terms of racial injustice and economic inequity. And what happened in 68, I think, is also, there are some parallels here in terms of there's what's happening on the streets, and then there's actually how it plays out on television, or what we see on our screens. And now it may be a TV screen, or it may be a computer screen, or a smartphone screen. But how that narrative is shaped and who gets to shape it is going to be extraordinarily consequential. That does not mean that, protest can be very politically unpopular, and that does not mean that there's not a rightness to that. And I think the scale and the scope, and as the parent of teenagers, I feel this, Gen Z lives in my house, and I see what they're taking in and how they're responding. And I teach them in my classroom, and I am given, they are engaged in a way that the previous generation was not. And this all that's happening now is shaping them going forward tremendously.
Yeah. Well, thank you both, David and Margaret. It's so great to be with you. I wish I could take you out to dinner tonight, but we'll have to wait.
We'll give you a rain check.
Yeah, we'll take a rain check. I want to thank our audience for your engagement. And I don't know if Bill wants to sign off, or we should just end here. Bill, did you have a final comment?
No, other than thank you all. I said you were doing a great job wrapping up, and it's delightful to see Margaret and David again. And I look forward to welcoming you back at the center when we get past all of this.
Well, thank you, Bill. And thanks to all our great colleagues at the Miller Center for making this happen.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.